You know, I find it really funny how people can look at me with a straight face and tell me that Nintendo is not greedy, and then at the same time celebrate their Black Friday deals. Nintendo might be the stingiest company on the planet, especially in the gaming world. Consider this, they've just launched what is the fastest shipped out console in the world. They have so many users that have now jumped ship from the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. They're flying high, right? Their shareholder value is doing great over the past year. It all looks so good for them. They can move on to the Nintendo Switch 2, and maybe they can provide a deal for their loving and loyal fan base. And then Black Friday comes around and you just remember that this is Nintendo we're talking about, and no matter how well they are perceived to be doing, their first party Black Friday discounts might be some of the most insulting numbers that I have seen from any video game company. And this is specifically talking about numbers that are going directly from Nintendo. You might find better deals elsewhere. You will find better deals elsewhere. You'll find deals for first-party games on the Switch 2 elsewhere. And outside of the United States, you'll even find discounts on Nintendo Switch 2 hardware itself. But specifically looking at Nintendo's own deals, their own sales, man, are they just not willing to give even an inch to anybody. Well, I guess they've given kind of half an inch here, because they do have some sales for Black Friday. So over on the Nintendo store, you'll find that they have unveiled their cyber deals. These are in effect until December 3rd. First thing I did was filter it to see what the Switch 2 games were discounted at. And obviously, there's not a discount on anything first party. Not even Welcome Tour and Drag X Drive. No deals for any Switch 2 edition upgrades, nothing. But I didn't really expect any deals from any first-party Switch 2 titles, I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that. What I would expect is a pretty healthy discount on Switch 1 games. Right, because naturally you would expect that when you move on to the next console and the holidays comes around, this is kind of the time to let people start buying things on discount, at least a pretty good discount especially. You know, maybe even a good Switch 1 bundle. Move some of those if you want to. But obviously they're not gonna do this. And in part, it's because the Switch 1 cannot be too appealing for people to go out and buy it. If they price it too low, it will take away some of the Switch 2 holiday sales. And for a whole other reason, with their games, they can't price those too low either, because part of the whole appeal of the Nintendo Switch 2 is that you get to play the Switch 1 library. It's a pro console, after all. So even though we're looking at games from a previous generation for a previous console, some of which have not even gotten a Switch 2 edition update, the only thing they can do on the Switch 2 is run. And what's worse is a lot of them run at a stretched resolution because the screen is 1080p, but they take a stretched 720p screen and they put it on there when you're playing handheld. But despite that, still, Nintendo does not have any generosity for people that want to buy their old last-gen console. Or they would like to experience those old last-gen games that Nintendo has really milked and will continue to milk for the foreseeable future. But without further ado, here is Nintendo's very generous offering going into the holidays for the Black Friday sales. And it's about as underwhelming as you would expect from this very lucrative company. Splatoon 3, $41.99. That's a 30% discount on a game that came out in September of 2022. And that's likewise with Paper Mario: The Origami King, except that game came out in July of 2020. And similarly, Luigi's Mansion 3, a game which launched in October of 2019. But with Luigi's Mansion, if you still pay an additional $7, you get the multiplayer pack set, the DLC that came with it. That DLC, which is usually sold for $10, has gone down to a whopping $7. Again, for a game that came out in 2019. You'd think part of the deal, they would just kind of like bundle in the DLC, but no. And there's a similar situation with the Splatoon 3 expansion pass as well. For a 30% discount, you can get it for $18. Now remember, WarioWare Move It, that game came out in 2023 and was priced at $50. So you'd think that maybe that also gets the 30% discount that all the other games are getting, but no, they don't want to price it too low. They want to cap it at $40 just like the other two games, so it only gets a 20% discount. So it's yet another $40 Switch 1 title that should be way cheaper. And that's it. That is the entirety of the first party offering for the Nintendo Switch Black Friday sales. Nintendo Switch, not Nintendo Switch 2. Of course, any game that got a Switch 2 edition version or got one of those free updates where it got spruced up, those don't go on sale. You might be able to grab those on a physical deal with participating retailers, but that will be limited stock. And I'm guessing in most of those cases, it'll just be units that are just still sitting there left over from their Switch 1 years. And come to think of it, the only one of those games that's actually getting some kind of deal in the physical stores is Mario Odyssey, a game that came out in 2017. And the best thing Nintendo could do is like a $40 deal for that title. And it's barely even Nintendo doing it, it's the participating retailers. And honestly, this needs to be addressed because one of the biggest talking points that I see always comes up are so many weirdos online that like to pretend that Nintendo is actually generous with their pricing, and they do offer discounts, plenty of discounts throughout the years even. And as such, everybody that's online saying that Nintendo games do not go down in price is just rage baiting. I don't know why they are in denial of this fact and they're trying to pretend otherwise. A discount for games temporarily during a specific window is not a price drop. That is just a sale. It's a temporary sale. Switch 1 titles, especially ones that are sold prior to like 2021 at least, and honestly I would argue all Switch 1 titles because it is a last-gen console now, supposedly, those games should permanently be available at $40 maximum. So that when Black Friday comes around, they knock off 30% of that price. And honestly, they should be even lower than $40. These are last-gen games. But that could be a discussion for a different time. The point that I'm trying to make is that anybody that says that Nintendo games actually do go down in price because of these dumb sales that happen every now and then is completely burying their head in the sand towards Nintendo's greed. Like if you were to come up to me and be like, hey, Nintendo doesn't drop the price of their games because everybody is still buying them, I'd say, yeah, that's a sound argument. But to completely shrug away the fact that Nintendo does not drop their games' prices, and the justification for the argument being that Nintendo does these discounts, these very weak and underwhelming discounts for only a select few games every few months, is absolutely absurd. Although, in fairness, it's not even remotely the most absurd thing you see from Nintendo fans these days, so I guess I'm not surprised by that. But still, it's all very clear Nintendo refuses to drop the price of previous generation titles because that's how they want to fluff the library for the Switch 2. They want people to come in and buy a Switch 2 and pick up the games that they didn't buy on the Switch 1. And by not dropping the price for the Switch 1 titles, even if they lose out on half the sales they could get, it doesn't matter to them because one $60 game sold is worth 3 that are sold at $20 discount. And since they're clearly succeeding at tricking people into continuing to buy Switch 1 titles at full price for their Switch 2, which is basically just a Switch Pro, they're definitely going to continue to milk these people for as long as they can, because every single dollar counts. And it's just so scummy. It's nothing but greed, and you can see it. It's so obvious. You convinced so many people to go out there and buy a Nintendo Switch 2. The biggest marketing push for the Switch 2 was that it was going to be a Switch 1, but stronger. It was going to play all of your old games and play them better. After the slow drip feed of games leading to the end of the Switch 1's life, everybody expected to come into the Switch 2 and start seeing games released left and right. All of the primary Switch 2 games didn't start coming out until like this month. And even then it's like 2 of them, I think. Hyrule Warriors and Air Riders are the only ones since Bonanza. And throughout that entire time, they were either pushing Switch 1 games either via free updates or via Switch 2 editions, or just in general being like, hey, you should get the Switch 1 games, because that'll fill up your library for the Switch 2. Play your Switch 1 games on here. And from Furukawa's own mouth, he said that if you need more games to play and you haven't played them yet, buy Switch 1 titles. That's even what Doug Bowser said when he said people that can't afford the Switch 2 should just play Switch 1 games and buy a Switch 1. But despite all of that, they don't even make the Switch 1 games appealing. Not only do they hold off on giving every single Switch 1 game a proper facelift, a proper update, so that it could at least be 1080p handheld. I mean, it should be 4K on dock too, but at least give them the 1080p handheld instead of the 720p that's stretched out and looks worse. But they don't provide that, and then in addition to that, you're paying full price for these Switch 1 titles on your Nintendo Switch 2. Effectively getting a worse experience with some of these games with the Switch 2 than you would have on the Switch 1. Nintendo is trying to have its cake and eat it too, and it might be working. They've put little to no effort to make the Switch 1 games appealing for the Nintendo Switch 2, despite trying to advertise this console as a beefier Switch 1 that's going to play your Switch 1 games better. Because outside of the Nintendo Switch 2 editions and outside of the free updated games like Mario Odyssey and 3D World and Scarlet and Violet, you have games like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, games like Smash Bros, and all of the other massive amounts of first-party titles for the Nintendo Switch 1 that got nothing going into the Nintendo Switch 2. And despite that, you're expected to buy those games at full price. Even now, with the launch of the next console, after dropping your $450 to $500 for this thing, and you're still expected to pay full price for those old games, and in most of those cases, receive an inferior experience. Quite frankly, I think Nintendo does not get enough crap for the stuff that it pulls, especially when it comes to how terrible they are with discounts, with sales, with price drops for the Nintendo Switch 1. This is hilariously bad.